when they start trying to put the evil of the world on the Jewish people, it's only a matter of time before they go down that road where now the Jews become the gravity around which everything spins. They become so obsessed with it. It's like an all-consuming thing. I mean, they feel to me like they have gone mad, and they have gone mad around this issue of the Jewish people.
Hello and welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast. This is a weekly interview show where I sit down and talk with authors, thought leaders, and influencers who help us understand our changing world. New episodes release every Friday. My guest this week is Christopher Kuehl. Christopher has traveled extensively to over 30 countries, doing both mission-related work and photography. He lived in Israel for many years and returns frequently. He has worked for Sony and Rolling Stone magazine as a photographer and has also been a founder of 4 different technology companies. During his first stay in Israel more than a decade ago, the Lord spoke to him about a bridge that he wanted to build between Israel and the church. A decade later, Chris is answering the call to be part of this bridge. Besides being the COO of Restore7, an organization that focuses on cultural reformation through the Seven Mountains, Chris is also the founder of Present Witness, an organization that addresses modern theological questions and challenges as it relates to Israel, the Jewish people, and the church. Chris is currently earning his master's degree in theology, and he, his wife Justice, and their young son live in Tennessee. Chris is also the author of Is God a Zionist? Finding God's Story in a World Obsessed with Israel. Christopher, welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast.
Will, great to be here. That's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think there's so many different parts of your story that are like, a photographer, Sony tech founder, going to Israel, writing a book about Zionism, the international man of mystery.
Yeah, I hope to dispel that rumor.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think those who are listening, who've been listening to the podcast for a while, will see, and you and I have talked about this, a lot of overlap, sort of between our stories, just sort of a wide and varied kind of background that all seems to kind of be, and you and I have talked about this at length, it's kind of converging around this question of Israel, at least for me, quite unexpectedly.
Yes. Yeah, no, there's so many crossovers. I just to get personal about this for a second, I was really shocked actually to see how much of our past history, even pre-Jesus, was similar. And then I think we both kind of accidentally found ourselves in Israel at very different points in the timeline. But that certainly was not on my bingo card, I guess, if you will, that I would be connected to Israel in this way. So I was kind of fascinated to learn about all of our overlap here.
Absolutely. So I don't know. I don't know. We can just dive in anywhere into that story. I mean, where would you like to start? Because ultimately, of course, I'd like to get to your book. And just real quick, what's so interesting about this book in particular is that you sent me, you contacted me through my website in early December, heading into the holidays, and then I went to Israel in January, and I came back and I found the note that you had sent me, and it's like, oh wow, this is suddenly very relevant. So your timing was providential, one might say.
Yeah. No, and I had no idea that you were going to be on that trip to Israel. I had just kind of seen some of your interactions online, and they were not insane, which is where I feel like the general direction of the internet has gone over the last 2 years. And I was like, it would be great to talk with Will about this and see. So that was providential. And I had no idea about that, but I'm glad that the Lord worked the timing out that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I try not to be insane. It's a daily effort.
You'd be surprised how many people can't pass that basic muster these days,
Well, it's wild. Let's start there then. So here you are, and I'm sure we'll have touch points of your story along the way. Here you are with travel, photography, and our pre-Jesus life, which both touch on Burning Man as well, and then also being a founder of technology companies, and now you're writing a book about Israel, which by the way is excellent, and I've communicated this to you. Like it's a very needed, popular treatment, accessible treatment of a lot of subjects that I think people they can't avoid anymore. So maybe we'll just start, like, what inspired the writing of the book? How did the book come to pass?
Yeah. Well, I had never honestly given much thought to writing a book. Like, my writing was not in my background per se. I kind of always despised education to some degree when I describe education. Maybe I'll say formal education. I've always been like a ferocious reader. And ever since I was young, I mean, I constantly self-taught myself things. That was really, I become almost like OCD level insane when I start really diving in on something. But that's always been very in my own, like, I'm going to go out and pursue something, and I'm going to be like, I'm going to teach myself some. That's kind of the way that I process things. I never did well in a classroom. That was never very attractive to me. That was just not my. So the idea of me writing a book was kind of like crazy. Like I would have never put myself in that position, 20 years ago. And even my academic. My undergrad and everything was in accounting and finance. I actually wanted to go work up at Goldman Sachs or on Wall Street. And so, I was really, that was more my leaning. And so the writing of the book was something that in many ways, I feel like the Lord has been writing the story for 20 years in my heart in some ways, but it didn't become real until probably 3 or 4 years ago. And when I was finishing up a master's degree in theology, and I was seeing all this crazy stuff happening online and this conversation around Israel and the Jewish people and the church and all these things kind of bubbling up in a way that I don't know. I just started feeling like called into this. This is maybe a bad example, but like when Frodo was like, I wish the ring had never come to me. I have a little bit of that feeling of like, man, this is like, if you want to become super unpopular, write a book about Zionism. Honestly,
That's right.
and so it's not exactly been an easy time to write such a book, but I couldn't escape it, I guess, if that makes sense. And so, the process has taken me over the last year of doing, but I feel like I've been writing it for 20 years, and it just kind of flowed out. So I guess that's my long answer to your short question.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I think everything started exploding, at least as far as the public was concerned, about Israel after October 7th, 2023. That was such an important shift for so many different reasons. And that was when things really started to go crazy, but it's not like the conversation is new. It just kind of took a new kind of destructive and as you said, insane direction.
Yeah.
And it's, it sounds like you felt called to speak into that.
Yeah, definitely. And, that was really, I guess, what led me there. I think for a couple of reasons. I've lived in Israel multiple times. I've been over there almost 20 times at this point. I've been to the West Bank. I've been to Syria. I've been to Jordan. I've been to the Sinai. I mean, I've like, so when that happens, you start to become almost immune to at least a certain type of propaganda about the Middle East. Maybe not all of it. I think it's really hard with current events to know exactly what's going on. I would never kind of position myself that way because, I am skeptical of many things, that's being said right now. But it does make you, I would say, immune to much of where like the public talks about this on the internet because it's just so clueless, if I don't know any other way to say it, to what reality is actually like for multiple levels. And so, yeah, I just made the decision between that and between feeling like, I had done a very, very deep dive on basically everything that the church has thought about Israel and the Jewish people over the last 2,000 years and kind of built a case around these ideas and the stream of thought and tried to square certain things that I feel like is just not really common in the online discourse right now. And so basically the book is 3 parts. I give a brief history of the split between basically the synagogue and the church. That's the first 2 chapters. And then the next 6 chapters is more or less a biblical case for Israel. And then the last 4 or 5 chapters are the modern implications around what I think this means for the church. And so that's the basic outline of the book.
Mm-hmm. What was your process like beginning to assemble this book? Obviously, I've been to the Middle East a little bit, and so I know nothing will show you just the poverty of dialogue about the world in America. Then going to actually see the world, and you see how little, everything that America creates flows outward, but very little flows inward. And so we get just the tiniest little sound bites more about the Middle East probably than anywhere, but to actually go and be in these places, be like, wow, this is wildly incorrect.
Yeah.
So what was go ahead, please.
Well, I remember when I was living in these major cities, specifically, when I was spending a lot of time in Brooklyn and New York and stuff, and the headlines are always like, oh, New York is so dangerous. And then you get into it and you're like, no, it's not dangerous at all. Like, you never actually experience any of the things that they're writing about. I think that's pretty accurate to how I found the Middle East, is that these kind of singular moments in time get very sensationalized through the news. And so, you basically, and that's really what social media is. It's a vignette about a very small moment in these very large stories. And then that small moment gets hyper fixated on, and it kind of gets amplified in this weird way, and it skews what everyone's perception is kind of about everything. And so that's really, I think, definitely at work in this story. And so, I made the decision to kind of start every chapter with a personal story. Sometimes I talked about my experience with the Palestinians, the Arabs. Sometimes I talk about it with the Jews. Sometimes I talk about it with the Christians. And so I just kind of, and I did that in many ways. Just, I tried to write this book as assuming that laymen would be reading it. I obviously I've written a bunch of academic and theological papers, but no one reads that stuff. It's it's insanely boring. Your average person who's working 9 to 5, who has 4 kids, is not going to pick up and read a theology book, generally speaking. And so I wanted something that really anyone could read. And so that was kind of in many ways, I feel like it was a translation project, if that makes sense, trying to translate stuff like theological ideas and themes into something accessible that someone who has never had any kind of academic training could pick up and read and have a basic understanding of the contours of the discussion, at least.
Mm-hmm. So can you kind of describe the ideal audience for the book? I mean, reading it, I got a sense of it. Like, obviously, if you want to read super intense politics, there are sources for that. Or if you want to read really intense, like, sort of history. But I think you wanted to take, sort of like, well, here's the surface level that we get through the media. Let's cut several layers beneath that and make sure it's cited and sourced, and documented, but also, provide a clearer picture for people that are being kind of inundated with stuff about Israel. It's like, okay, I guess I have to care about this now. So where do I begin?
I think that's a really great analysis of it. So, I wrote it as a non-dispensational Zionist, first of all. And so, none of the argumentation in there will be dispensational in terms of its theological approach, which is not to slander or cut out dispensationalists. There's just a lot of books out there already for that audience. And so because of that, I use a lot of Reformed theology. I use Catholic theology, which some of the Reform side probably won't like, but I did that for the sake. I was trying to look at the voice of many waters in the church. And so, I go through the church fathers, I go through the medieval stuff, I go through, and obviously there is extensive treatment on all. You could take every chapter in this book and you could write like a massive academic book just on the topics in that chapter. And so it's not meant to be exhaustive, but it is meant to give, it's almost like you're climbing up a mountain, and each chapter is kind of a foothold that takes you at least to the top. And so you've got some understanding of what the ascent to this kind of location is like. And so that was really the heart behind it. And what I was trying to show is that the basic case for Zionism has been made throughout church history to some degree. And, you can see at least the shape of it. That doesn't mean that it looked like, what we might consider American dispensational churches. That doesn't, mean that, they would co-sign on Bibi Netanyahu or everything the IDF does or any of that kind of stuff. If I were to describe Zionism as just a basic, the real definition for Zionism is the Jewish right of return to its ancestral land. Now, if I were to talk about how some of the church fathers and people in theology have talked about it, it is, they might have called it like they believe that the Jews would be regathered to the land of Israel at some point in the future. And so if we just keep that very minimal definition and don't apply like, that means you have to do this politically, or that means that America needs to do this, or X, Y, and Z. Like if you just take all of that out, which I recommend people doing, especially right now, then you're left with this very simple idea. Would the Jews eventually be regathered to the physical land of Israel? And I believe that the case is yes for that. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
What's so interesting about this? Actually, I'm going to reach for another book. I've got a small stack of books here. It's really more like a pile by my desk side, but like about Israel and the Jews and anti-Semitism. But there's one in particular I want to get. Hold on, and it's right here. It's Warrant for Genocide, which you pointed me to this edition, and we'll get into some other ones. But what's really interesting about this is that we today, all of us today, are growing up and alive in the Israel era. Meaning, like, we've never, probably everyone listening can't remember a time prior to the existence of the state of Israel.
Right.
So, but if you go back prior to there being a state of Israel, the Jews were in diaspora scattered around the earth. And I don't know that I ever fully appreciated just what a precarious position that was for Jews in the nation, in the nations of the world, that they were subject to pogroms, where if a local community decided that there was a problem somehow, it must be the Jews' fault. And so they were subject to the whims of national governments. They were subject to the whims of different communities, different political organizations, and different kind of madnesses that would sweep through these communities and target the Jews as scapegoats, many of whom, lived in, particularly in Europe, in quite serious poverty. And so it's difficult for us to imagine what it must have been like for Jews back then. But if you imagine they were the subject of persecution for centuries, it's a little bit easier to understand, like, well, maybe they should have their own nation now. And especially thinking about what happened in National Socialist Germany, like, that aside, that's a component of it. Certainly it's a big part of it. But then they go to Israel and it's like, but then now they're still subject to persecution, right? So it's like, you don't want them in your countries. So now they have their own country and they can't have that. Where are they supposed to go? Yeah. And the answer, tragically, according to Warrant for Genocide and other books, is like, they should go away, which, I speak euphemistically, perhaps.
Man, we could talk about this idea for, I feel like, forever. I had an article come out in the Christian Post on Monday, where I make the case that anti-Zionism is the new form of anti-Semitism, which is basically that case, which is that, the Jews have been hated just as much as when they had a country as when they didn't. And essentially what we're saying is that we just want no Jews. Like, we are unhappy as a world when they have a nation, and we are unhappy when they're in our midst. And so where does that leave us exactly? What does that mean? And a lot of the church father writing, which I touch on this in the book, was believed that the Jews would be perpetually in a wandering state, a landless, nationless, and that was their permanent judgment for everything that happened with Jesus and this whole, that whole first century kind of reality. And so what's interesting about what the church fathers say about this, though, is their whole presupposition, like their praxis, their foundation of this belief, was that the Jews had been scattered. And so when that foundation goes away, as it did in 1948, and the Jews are reconstituted, and there's a nation again, and there's all these other things, that basically takes out the foundation of the arguments that they were trying to make. And if they were still alive, I actually believe that they would see that, because it's so clear in their writing that was their presupposition for basically every one of their beliefs that came after it. And they wrote about it in such a way that you can't blame the regathering of the Jews back onto dispensationalism or Rothschilds or UN or like whatever it is that you want to blame the modern state of Israel on. Their belief was that God was keeping them in this permanent state, right? And so the idea that anything that any one of man's schemes, if you want to call it that, could overcome God's judgment was it's not a viable argument for the argument that they were putting forward. And so, I think the world does not know what to do with this now, and it's causing. I mean, it really is a cup of reeling for everyone that tries to interact with this right now. And we can talk about why we might think that is, but I think it's kind of hard to deny that this small piece of land with these 7 million Jews and 2 million Arabs has become kind of the flashpoint for a lot of conversation right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you definitely spoke about this in the book, and when you and I spoke last week, which was lovely, by the way. I think we touched on that as well. The idea that the church fathers looked and they made the very natural conclusion that this was a permanent judgment. They had been the Jews had been scattered in diaspora. The temple had been destroyed. I think, in the book you talk about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and then the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 130, and then they go everywhere. And it's like, it's very natural that the church fathers would look at this like, yeah, that looks pretty bad. I don't know how they're going to come back from this one. Right? I'm paraphrasing.
Totally.
but I think you're right that if you were to wind the clock forward, 1,800 years, like, oh, did not see this coming. Maybe it's time to kind of reevaluate some of the things that were said, because you can't say God's hand is not at work in this, especially given the number of wars that Israel has won, the sort of providential circumstances that make that possible. And I think that troubles people to see God moving so clearly in world history in this undeniable way. And I think it should, like, troubling is not the right word, but it should be maybe awe-inspiring in an uncomfortable way.
Yeah. I think what I find so tragic about the moment that we're in some pockets of, really every denomination in the church right now, is this kind of unwillingness to recognize that God's hand might be at work, even if this is like a really messy situation in some ways, because I think that we are losing sight of something that could be a really encouraging visible miracle for the church to observe. And I think because so many people in the church are at war with this idea, we are missing this really pretty miraculous thing that I feel like an honest person, there's an apologetics book called God and the Science, and God and the Science of Evidence, I think is what it's called. And in one of the chapters, these guys are not Zionists, they're scientists. They write about the Jewish regathering in 1948, and they talk about how unparalleled this is, and so if you look at anthropology, for instance, the way that they would define an ancient people as surviving is through basically, are they on the same land? Do they speak the same language, and do they worship the same God? So those are kind of the three categories that an anthropologist would look at to define, has this ancient people survived? And out of all of the ancient peoples of the world, it's only the Jews having come back to Israel. And so I think that there's something about that I just don't think we can just brush away, even if that would be more convenient at times. I think that there's something here that the Lord is drawing our eyes to right now, if we have eyes to see, and if we have ears to hear.
And I think that naturally, like, I think someone who would object to all this from having read so much of their writings, for example, in Black Sun, right? Which, from just having been living in this book for 2 months in the book club, that I think people who were opposed to that would say, oh no, it's not the hand of God at work, it's the hand of some dark evil conspiracy. Right. They would look at that and say it's, the Jews as the center of all evil, for recorded history, essentially, or at least since in the post Christ era, right, or in the Christian era. And so they would say, no, this is somehow outside the hand of God. And they do actually get pushed into some really uncomfortable places. That's where they depart from biblical theology, and they get to Manichaeanism, that it's like, God and the devil locked in this struggle of equals for all of history. It's like, it pushes on a lot of people's buttons that they can't get there, right? And it's interesting to see the things that come up, particularly around baby boomers as well, and the anger at previous generations. Like, it seems to be stirring up all of this stuff inside people, and then tragically being weaponized by influencers for political power. And so that's the moment kind of we're in. That's what it looks like to me, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a really great analysis, and it feels like that whole thing is speeding up. It's like a top on the table that just keeps spinning faster and faster and faster. And I'm like, man, it can't go any faster. And it keeps going faster. And, I think we are in that moment. And, there's a Catholic writer. I think his name is E. Michael Jones. Have you ever read any E. Michael Jones?
I know E. Michael Jones. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so his whole thing is, he believes that the Jewish people, as basically an entire race, has the spirit of Judas in them, I think is what he would call that. And so, all of his books are really, they're just exactly like what you're saying in the Black Sun, only it puts a much more religious spin on it. And so, he's a perfect example of someone who would see the modern state of Israel, all this stuff is just kind of demonic in origin, and that it is still the rebellion of the Jews against, the God of the universe. And so, that belief is very, it's competing with what we're talking about right now,
Yeah, what's so funny about E. Michael Jones is his first book, Libido Dominandi, which he wrote, I think it came out in 1999. That is an excellent book, the first edition.
Yeah.
He released a new edition, which I haven't read yet. That is an
Mm-hmm.
excellent, excellent book about the history of the sexual revolution. Not a
Yeah.
mention of Jews anywhere in it. Are you just
Mm-hmm.
reading it? It's like, this is incredible, especially his chapter on Wilhelm Reich. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, so I recommend that book very highly, but it seems like after that book came out, he started going in a very serious
Yeah.
anti-Jewish kind of direction. And it's like,
Yeah. And
go ahead.
well, just to that point, I find that when someone like when they start like making this the thing, when they start trying to put the evil of the world on the Jewish people, I feel like it's only a matter of time before they go down that road where like now the Jews become the gravity around which everything spins. It's just
Right.
they become so obsessed with it. Like it's like an all consuming thing. I mean, they feel to me like they have gone mad, and they have gone mad around this issue of the Jewish people. And so I think that, but E. Michael Jones would see Protestantism that way as well.
Yes, that's true.
He sees all of this as kind of an apostate from the Catholic Church, and so he's got his kind of his own take on all this. But it's a very animating idea when people grab onto this and they choose to go down the road of scapegoating Jews, which I think the nation of Israel kind of stands as a political foil, if you will, to just now it's the only nation of Jews. And so it's more of a socially acceptable way to be an anti-Zionist, which is different than saying I disagree with Israel's policies, or we should have rigorous debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or, should America be funding any kind of foreign aid? Like none of those conversations are inherently anti-Zionist, but an anti-Zionist is someone, obviously who's saying, I do not believe there should be a home for the Jewish people. And so that has become now the acceptable way of putting what I think has always been just the anti-Semitism in the world onto the Jewish nation.
And this brings me to another book, again, from my stack, because I just happen to have them right here. I've got this Jean-Paul Sartre, Anti-Semite and Jew,
There you go.
which is about the character of anti-Semites. And that's the thing. I didn't even know this book existed. And observing the behavior of people who start getting into the stuff. I've told so many of these stories. I've watched so many friends fall into this, like literally guys that I thought like we were going to be bros for life. One guy was the godfather to his daughter. Another guy I saw literally every week. These are men that I thought were going to be in my life for a long time. And I watched them slowly walk up to the edge of the cliff and then just dive off. It's like, where are you going? And I think that I'm not the only one who has seen this phenomenon. Many people have seen it in their churches and their families, and I get emails about it all the time. And my understanding, you've read this book, maybe you can speak about it. It is that it captures the character of anti-Semites quite well. That it maybe doesn't understand, maybe Jean-Paul Sartre doesn't understand Jews all that good, but he certainly understands the people who hate them, and that seems to be a diagnosable malady, let's call it.
It's exactly how I've described that book. It's very, very useful for understanding what happens to people who become obsessed about Jews. And, it's almost like whatever that virus is that takes over someone's thinking. And, when that scapegoat becomes kind of all consuming, he has an excellent way of articulating that. I quoted him a couple times in my book, and he has just a fascinating perspective when it comes to, diagnosing anti-Semitism.
Yeah, when you have to find, I think it's part of it is a search for an all-encompassing answer for everything.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
It becomes sort of a mania, which I think is it's like, doesn't Chesterton talk about that in Orthodoxy? Right, the rationalist tries to get everything inside his head. Maybe it's a manifestation of that.
Yeah, well, I think that people, especially after COVID, I find that after there were kind of two breaks that I feel like I've observed when it comes to this issue, COVID and then October 7th. Those two things have both been massively animating. COVID kind of destroyed the foundation of trust in whatever was remaining, in institutions and in academia and all that, for all the obvious reasons. And then October 7th happened, and I think that what position we're in now is people are kind of looking for like that grand unifying theme
Yeah.
of reality, right? They want the simple answer to complex things. It's incredible how, whether we're talking about, the source of the protocols, the Elders of Zion in Russia or France, it's very animating to pin the evils of the world on the Jews. And it's bizarre because in this kind of self-fulfilling way, in some ways, people look at history and they're like, yeah, look at, everyone has seen it this way. Like, the Jews are the problem, man. Like, and so and most people don't go deeper than that layer. And that's been one of the challenging things about this moment that we're in right now, is I find that so much of what's happening just is like reinforcing this idea in ways that I guess I frequently catch me off guard, to be totally honest.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to pin misfortune or sin on someone else. So rather than saying, rather than rejoicing in all circumstances and under the hand of a God in terms of hard providences, oh no, this is because we're being cursed by the Jews or whatever. Or rather than saying, yeah, it's I have an addiction to whatever, say porn is a big thing right now. Oh, it's all the Jews' fault. It's like, hold on a second. Like, so first of all, the hand of God's providence is still moving, and this is for your sanctification. All things work together for the good, right? All things, all meaning all, right? And then also, like, you're running the mouse, bro. You know what I mean? Whatever website you're visiting, whatever you're running up on the credit card, you're doing that. And that's the part that part gets very uncomfortable for people.
Totally. I've got another piece that's coming out on this idea. And one of the things that I say at the end is like, rather than look for a grand unifying theme for why evil is in the world, I can tell you really easily that all you need to do is look in the mirror, and the evil in the world is because of you, and it's because of me, and it's because of all of us. And that is why there's evil in this world. Like, we don't need to blame this on a group of people. Like, it's inherent in each one of our actions. And so I just think that, to your point, why take that level of responsibility if you can offload this to whatever it is? And in this case, the Jews. Even reading about early Russia, in the 1900s, I was so fascinated by one of the things that they said, how when it was the Reds and the Whites versus each other, neither group could really come up with like a unifying theme to get people to believe in what they were doing or to join and stuff, until it became animated around blaming the Jews. And that ended up being a very animating idea. And so I think, I don't know. It's hard for me to not see it as in some ways connected to some kind of spiritual influence to some degree. I'm like, you just get so much return for hating the Jews, and kind of it feels to me, I don't know any other word to say this with, but it feels almost like a supernatural return when you make that your goal,
Absolutely. It's definitely supernatural. And then I'm just going to keep pulling from the stack of books. I've got The Plot, The Secret History of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was 2004. It's a comic book. I've talked about this in the Black Sun book club. That'll be out before this one, but it's a comic book telling the origin story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So whereas Warrant for Genocide is he talks about the origin story as well, but he was writing in 1967. In the late 1990s, additional archival materials became available, and the true name of the forger was more precisely identified. So Warrant for Genocide is really great about, here the protocols were drafted, here's what we think happened, but then they were very good on the impact, the immediate impact, because it was written in the 1960s. Then along comes the book The Plot 40 years later with additional archival materials, which has a much more precise explanation of like how the protocols were forged, and focuses less on the impact, which by that point was more well known. And you have, the way that he tells the story is like, just as you say, we're going to use this as a weapon to animate people against their czarist loyalists. They see creeping democracy, creeping in the broadest sense, liberalism, meaning like liberal democracy. And so they're czarist loyalists, so they have to produce something that pins this evil of democracy on somebody. So we're going to pin it all on the Jews, and we're going to rally everyone against liberal democracy and for the czar. and then ultimately they get run over by communism, but that's a whole other thing. So
totally.
So,
and exactly like what you're saying. And I mean, I've read stuff that's, considers the French Revolution and all this, which was really the first time, in 1500 years that the Jews had even relative close to like equal rights in society, was after the French Revolution. And it's not really hard to see why they were always, they wanted to be part of, not just part of this, but like who doesn't want to be like freer than they currently are? Like you don't need to be like a brain surgeon to understand why that would be. And so, it's incredible to me that people will pin this and say it was a mistake. And because, before that, Jews were basically living in poverty and ghettos for the last 1600 years. They were considered like a mystical, like leper people, that were not associated with, they had no influence, no power. And then bam, within 150 years of them getting like relatively free rights, the only thing that happens is that they become kind of the scapegoats for every evil like world problem, on a global scale. It's kind of unbelievable when you look at the timeline, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. And then to kind of go back to what I was saying, like the idea that the Jews were subject to pogroms in these communities, this sort of, like you said, mystical leper people. So we're going to pin all of our ills on them. Is it so difficult to understand that in the late 1800s, as nationalism was beginning to rise, that Jews would begin to say, hey, we kind of want our own nation because we're sick of being the scapegoats, right? And thinking, of course, that having their own nation would eliminate them from being scapegoats, but that appears to not have happened. So I think in many ways, what we're seeing is the playing out of an old pattern, an old scapegoating pattern, where all the problems of our civilization, which at the time were more locally minded, now it's like all the problems of global civilization are pinned on Israel, and that seems to be the thrust. In fact, I should probably write some content about that, write an article about that, about how when we were more locally minded, the local community of Jews were the scapegoat. Now that we're more globally minded, it's the global community of Jews are the scapegoat, and that function is always being served. I think someone recommended René Girard's The Scapegoat to talk about some of those subjects.
Yes, I totally agree. I think it's amazing how every time like the Jewish people get a little bit more freedom or some new thing happens to them that pushes them away from this kind of local perspective that you're talking about, then they become the center of that sphere of influence that they're in. And so it really does track exactly like you're saying.
And so so to bring it back to your book, I mean, we got more to go through on the stack right there. So as you started writing the book, I think you said like 4 years ago was sort of when you felt a little bit to start moving in that direction. And then the dialogue is moving so much around you, the river starts, the little stream starts picking up into a river, picks up into a flood. What was it like writing a book as everything was sort of shifting during the writing?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably one of the most difficult chapters to write was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict one, because every time I would write something, I'd have to change, 2,000 words on the October 7th thing and kind of what was going on there. And so that was constantly changing. And I just, in the end, decided to take a much broader view of that issue. And it was, to your point, it was very, very difficult in many ways to write those last few chapters that deal with the modern implications. But then I was kind of able to find stuff that I felt like, wow, this is really actually permanent. I'm going to be able to read this in 10 years and things are going to be the exact same way as what we're describing here, because they were the exact same way 200 years ago, and they were probably the exact same way 1800 years ago. And, if you look through history, there's always been some nation, some global empire that was trying to snuff out the Jews, and they seemed completely unable to do it after 4,000 years. And I write this in the book that you'd have to be kind of an insane person. I'm not even talking spiritually, like put the Bible aside. You'd have to kind of be insane to think that you're going to be the one that takes out the Jewish people. Like if you're looking at the historical record and you have any level of honesty, and you look at all the empires that have tried to take them out and they're basically all gone. And yet, now this 70-year-old Jewish nation is like what, the third largest nation on the NASDAQ. They went from basically being like socialist farmers on kibbutzes to being, this kind of technological superpower in the Middle East. And so it's hard for me to just process, I don't know. I wouldn't bet against this, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No, that's please go ahead.
and that's not a spiritual. I'm not trying to make a theological argument with that. I'm kind of just saying, like, if I was, I mean, I think you can make a theological argument about that, but I'm saying simply, if you're looking at the historical record and you're going to bet against this, like, I just wouldn't make that bet. I wouldn't do it. And that's kind of where all of my analysis on that. So that's where that's left me.
So you have me thinking right now that you're right. Like, don't bet against. We need to separate, and part of this is due to the confusion of terms, like the political nation state of Israel and the people and the government and all of that, versus perhaps the Jewish people and the ingathering that's happened there. Sort of, sort of a sense of spiritual Israel, meaning that the collection of people, versus national Israel being, Bibi Netanyahu and all of that.
Totally.
And certainly there's always room to criticize every human authority, right? Right, and that needs to be there.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't necessarily make someone anti-Semitic to have criticisms of a nation's policy or a leader. Please go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with all that.
Yeah. But then there's something else entirely going on that I think a lot of people who do genuinely hate the Jews try to hide behind what they consider are like, our political critiques, right? It's like, okay, I hear you saying that, but there's a note in your voice and something that you're saying that, like, this is not just academic political theory to you. There's something else going on. And it's that people group that you shouldn't bet against, because I think you're right. Every nation that has, and Scripture even says this, right? Like he uses the nations to judge Israel, and then he judges the nations. And
right.
Well, look. So real quick, here we go. Another book, Nazi Ecology by Dr. Mark Musser, right? So I read this in early 2024, and like one of the big things I took away from this book was, just how pagan. How capital P pagan the Nazis, Germany had become in the 1800s leading into the 1900s, and how pagan they were. And then, like, how viciously and justly did God judge Germany, right? So that was, totally. I don't think Germany's can come back from, they can come back with Christ, right? But I think they're still trying to figure that out for themselves.
Right.
And so I think you make a good point that, certainly you don't have to rubber stamp everything the nation of Israel does, but probably don't bet against or persecute the Jews. That's probably not going to work out well for you. Yeah.
And in fact, there actually has been, and I even thought about doing one of my academic papers on this, but to study the nations as soon as they expelled the Jews, and as soon as they had national policies against the Jews, what happens to a nation as soon as that happens? I can tell you from modern record that, in my opinion, England started going down as well as soon as they basically kind of betrayed what they had said they were going to do with the founding of the nation of Israel. People don't fully understand how difficult that process was. People think that England was a part of that in a positive way for the whole thing, and that's absolutely not true. But you can talk about where is England now. It's basically almost like an Islamic nation at this point, and so I think that. I think there's a lot of ways to think about this, but this is what I would kind of say to close the loop on this. If the Lord was telling me, I want you to go judge the Jewish people, I'd say, Lord, you take that to someone else. I do not want like that. That right. You're going to find a different guy. But I think that it's interesting because when we look at the nation of Israel, and I totally agree with everything that you're saying about, there's a note in certain people's tones when they talk about it. Like, for instance, when Rand Paul says that, and he's been saying this for 30 years, I don't think we should give foreign aid until we balance our budget. That's a completely reasonable. Maybe we should be doing that. I would be totally for that. I'm not against like a statement like that. I think that's a completely reasonable. Let's bring that up and talk about that as a Congress who could be useful. When Tucker Carlson goes on a 90-day tirade against Israel and talks about how much, foreign aid is killing us, when the reality is that all foreign aid combined is less than 1% of GDP, doesn't mean we should be doing it. I'm just saying, like, you just cannot, there's a different tone in the way that he talks about it than someone like Rand Paul, for instance, And so I think that it's becoming clear what someone is really saying when they're talking about this issue. And I think that in Israel, it's just, you look at the UN and the human rights committees, they've passed more resolutions against Israel than than all the other nations combined. We're talking about Yemen, North Korea, Sudan, places where we actually have like documented genocides, and still there's been more resolutions passed against Israel than all these other nations combined. And it's kind of like, okay, you might disagree with how Israel's handling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's probably a conversation that we can have around that. But are they really worse than all these other nations combined? It's like, I think even with, if we were to look at anti-Semitism, you always hear, let's just talk about pornography for a second, because you kind of brought it up in terms of, people love to talk about the OnlyFans guy who, was a Jewish guy. So the founder of OnlyFans was a Jewish guy, right? But
one of the founders. Yeah,
that's right. But if we look at, really the mainlining of pornography in America, I mean, I would say Larry Flint and Hugh Hefner really kind of paved the way on that. They're both Gentiles from Christian homes, right? But you never hear
Bob Guccione
yes,
as well.
Yes,
that doesn't sound like a Jewish name to me. I don't know.
But so you have this, right? But when people talk about the evil of pornography, you never hear them say, "Oh, the Gentiles who brought in pornography to America," right? Like it's always, right. But they always bring up the race of someone who's doing something bad when it's Jewish, and so that to me is kind of like how I would really describe anti-Semitism. It's not saying that Jews never sin. Like
of course
I could never, of course Jews, there's bad Jews, they do like that exists in all of this, but it's applying a different standard. It's bringing them up in a way that we don't do to ourselves. It's highlighting them in this way that we don't highlight ourselves. It's just a double standard. And I think that same standard is now being applied to the nation of Israel.
Absolutely. It's funny. I've been working on an article about the history of pornography and the mainstreaming of it. And I think I've researched like 40 names, something like that. And out of 40 names, there's like maybe five of Jewish ethnicity. And like, why is no one talking about like Jenna Jameson? Like Jenna Jameson was the first one who turned into this multi-millionaire kind of business. Is there anything for her? Why is it there's always this uniquely corrupting influence? Where's the room for sin in the Gentile community? Is there room for sin? Of course, absolutely there is.
Right.
And so you're right that it's a standard that's being applied unfairly and inconsistently. It's everyone else is the problem. These people are the problem, not me, right? It's like, no, bro, you're the problem. Like everyone is the problem, and making any one people group more of the problem than anybody else.
Totally.
I know that how emotionally satisfying it can be. I know what clarity it can lend, but it's false clarity. It's destructive clarity, and as we talked about with the Jean-Paul Sartre book, it drives people insane, right? It's they're getting all this rationalism into their head. Finally it all makes sense, and you're going crazy as you do it. And I've seen it, bro. There was the guy who I was the godfather to his daughter. And he when he went crazy, right? And so the whole circumstances of the end of our friendship are difficult and for another time. But like shortly after, like everything kind of blew up, there he was on Instagram. He blocked me, by the way. There he was on Instagram posting unhinged rants in his garage about the Jews with these dark circles under his eyes. It was the craziest things. Like friends sent them to me. I'm like, what happened? Right? Yeah. Like, and I think that's just what happens to people is like suddenly have this clarity there where everything fits into this notion, like the Jews are behind it all. And then when you get there, you lose your mind. And then I don't know what happens after that. Right.
I know. Yeah. I see it over and over too with many people that I've even been to Israel with. And I'm like, man, this is incredible that like, you have been here and you can still, that still has not inoculated you against what's happening here. And I think more than anything, it just makes them miserable people. Like if we were to just look at what it's doing to the heart, it's so corrosive. Like it's so corrosive, and it's obviously super bad for society. It has all sorts of downstream implications. But if we look at just what it does to the individual heart, it's like going into like a shadow land, and you just cannot interact with reality in a meaningful way once you go down that road,
Yeah, I imagine that for writing this book, well, maybe you can talk about it. You've undoubtedly gotten some blowback, maybe some surprising blowback.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I get so much hate for this book, and I think that I've got friends that are kind of in disbelief that I would take a public stand like this on such an issue. When it's so clear that they're not real Jews and the Khazars are running everything, and the Rothschilds are behind this, and so I've heard it all. I cannot imagine there being anything that I have not. I've been sent every spreadsheet of every Jew running everything, and it's like, I've got. I've seen it all at this point. And so, and my social media, dude, is just a backlog of hate and, people calling me Goy 7,000, rat Jew, like what it is, the whole entire internet dialogue just kind of pointed at one issue right now. But, I was actually reading Hebrews 11 this morning, and it was really encouraging to me, but it was just talking about, our life and walk of faith and how the people before us, Hebrews 11 is obviously the faith chapter for people that are not familiar with that. But, it's so encouraging to me because it talks about just taking stands that are hard. And it's just something that I feel like is the walk. Like, when I'm okay walking the other direction. When I see an entire crowd moving one way, that's actually a kind of an indicator to me that, maybe I'm going the right direction. And that's not to, I'm sure that I'm making errors in my thinking in some ways and stuff. But I don't know. I don't like the direction that this is all going. And I can't imagine that this is going to end well.
To go back to something you said earlier, like look at the history of the nations that have sort of persecuted the Jews. And I think part of what's going on is I think there's a surface sort of political layer. And I think you're right that there's a spiritual layer. I think on the surface political layer, I think that there are international interests that have for a long time seen, like I'm talking like going back to the 1970s, that there's been a fracture in conservatism over the issue of Jews, like going back to the William F. Buckley kind of John Birch Society era, which is in like the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. Yeah. And so I think that they've known that for 50 years, and they've been exploiting it very effectively through the internet for political purposes to fracture conservative support for Donald Trump, weaken an administration that's actually against, our geostrategic enemies. And I think that's part of the plan. But I think maybe on a deeper level, if you could look at what's the surest way to destroy Western nations. Well, what happened to Germany? What happened to England? And now what could be the devil's strategy for America too, right? This is the surest way. And maybe those two streams are kind of what's going on at one at the surface level and at a much deeper spiritual level, because I can't deny that there is a supernatural component to this. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting perspective. Jordan Peterson actually kind of describes what you're talking about a little bit. He does it in different terms. For him, he describes Jews as kind of the canary in the coal mine. And as soon as, your society becomes really resentful of the Jews, then you're going to start to have major problems. Now, he ties that to more of an economic. It's because they're kind of the eternally successful group of people. And then what that generally, according to Jordan Peterson, says about your society is that you're becoming resentful towards anyone who's successful and anyone who does anything worthwhile because you're not those things. And I think that there's probably some truth to what he's saying there. But I think I agree more with what you are saying in terms of, I think that there's something deeper that could be a part of it. I think that, if we're talking about your friend in the garage, who's got circles under his eyes, and he's kind of become animated in this really dark way by this idea. What happens when an entire nation becomes that way, right? Like what happens when the nation is that dark person sitting in, and they think that they've got this all figured out and they're all animated by this idea. To me, it's they become kind of so corroded in their heart that just inherently takes the nation down a very bad road.
Hold on. I need to grab another book. I need to stand up for just a second. Hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on. All right, so let me plug my headphones back in. So this is another book that speaks to that. I mean, look, man, I've been looking up bibliographies. I've been going down reading rabbit holes, following reading rainbows all the way to the end, find the pots of gold, but like, honestly, it was because of Warrant for Genocide. It was like, okay, well, let me just check out this book, because here I am reading Black Sun, and Warrant for Genocide is mentioned in every chapter, sometimes multiple times in every chapter. So like, okay, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is what's being mentioned. And so it's like, okay. And then I go to the Black Sun, the website for New York University Press, to just look at what the, if there's any other authors they might recommend, because the author Nicholas Goodrick Clark passed away, I believe, in 2012. And so I'm looking, it's like, oh, there's Norman Cohn endorsing Black Sun. Wait, Norman Cohn, he wrote this book about the millennium. And then I go, oh, Norman Cohn wrote Warrant for Genocide about the protocols. So like, okay, I should probably read Warrant for Genocide. And so I start reading Warrant for Genocide. It starts sending me down these other rabbit holes of other people who had written books about anti-Semitism and of course the plot and all that. And so here we are with A Rumor About the Jews by Stephen Eric Bronner, Conspiracy, Anti-Semitism, and the Protocols of Zion. Now, Stephen Eric Bronner, I guess he's a Marxist, he's a critical theorist, so probably don't agree with him on politics, but he does talk about the history of anti-Semitism in this book in the early chapters as moving through 3 phases. The first phase is it's religiously based. The Jews say that we worship the one true God, all your other gods are false, and so that that creates a feeling of like, we don't like you saying that, right? Right? It's like we just want to keep to ourselves, but they're worshiping their God in defiance of us, and so that leads to a religious persecution. Also, of course, the Christian church is part of that as well. But then, beginning in the 1700s and 1800s, with the rise of liberal democracy, where Jews no longer had to be outcast in society, and they could campaign or petition for equal rights as well and integration into society, they started performing really, really well. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. One is that when you're kept on the outside of society for so long, when you're finally let in, you don't ever want to be cast out again, right? So let's become part of society and let's succeed and let's contribute to the society. But then their success started inspiring all of this resentment. Resentment, like, why are the Jews doing so well? There must be something evil or mystical about them. And then the third phase of anti-Semitism is where the protocols come from, which is as modernity continues to grow and spread, a liberal democracy continues to spread and unseat monarchies and czars and stuff like that. All of modernity gets pinned on the Jews as well. This was their plot that they hatched, waiting in the wings in these ghettos, right? And there's an author, Francis Parker Yockey, who Michael Spangler, if anyone knows that name, shared on X, and his whole thing is the Jews were waiting for their opportunity in 1750. They were crouching in their ghettos, we're going to get them, and then they jump out, right?
Dude, it's so funny.
And that's his word. That's literally the dude's worldview. That's the dude's worldview. And so anyway, Rumor About the Jews by Steve.
I mean, dude,
Bronner.
to be honest, if you were sitting in a ghetto for 1,500 years and you were able to kind of come up with a scheme to get to the top of things in 100 years, and you were like, maybe you deserve that. I don't know. Like maybe you are like that smart. You're like that Spockian smart that you deserve. like if you really believe that. But what's so funny to me about this, dude, is that these people, if they were alive in Egypt when Joseph was protected and raised up by God, if they would be around Daniel in Babylon, they would be convinced that there's this Jewish conspiracy, to take over their kingdoms. And you know what? They're not exactly wrong in a sense. If we describe God's God preserving the Jews through all of this as a Jewish conspiracy,
That's interesting. Like, would conspiracy theorists in the Egypt days, pro-Pharaoh loyalists look at this as like it's a Jewish
conspiracy to take over Egypt?
well, that's actually like that's funny, but there's also some reality to it. Like in the sense of like, no, like God has told you to stop doing this, and so now here are the plagues. Right here, like, and so is it a Jewish conspiracy in the traditional meaning of the word conspiracy, as in they're hatching a plot behind the scenes? No, but your civilization is struggling by being cursed by God for cursing these people, which He's telling you not to do. Like there's some reality to it. Like, oh, Moses, the chief rabbi Jew, is poisoning the river.
Totally. Daniel was able to figure out how to not get eaten by lions.
That's right.
He can interpret the dreams.
Lions are a Jewish plot.
So funny, dude.
But people would go in that direction, though.
Right, they totally would. I mean, like if Michael Spangler was alive right now in Egypt, he would be, whispering in the ear of the Pharaoh about a Jewish conspiracy against Egypt. Like that's just that's where he is,
So like a Grima Wormtongue style.
That's right. Exactly.
And it's so wild to see this taking hold and spreading. Like, I think part of it for me was like, I understood in 2024, the first half of 2024, that everyone's feeling a lot of anxiety about the election, that we had watched in 2020, a lot of shenanigans, a lot of shenanigans. And everyone was worried, like, is this going to happen again? Someone took a shot at Donald Trump, right? And so all this, and almost hit him. And so all of this stuff is churned up and everyone's feeling really a lot of angst and really like worried. And I expected that after the resounding election, Trump won, that all the bros, all the guys would be like, okay, cool. Like, now we can chill out and we can get to work building. But that's not what happened. What happened is things got worse. And that's the part that doesn't make sense. Like, there's something in there. Like, obviously there's a logical reason for that, or an irrational reason for that. It can be explained, but that was the part, like, this is not the predicted behavior.
I know. I keep thinking that the ride is going to end, that the crazy train, breaking into a new reality that happened after COVID, that we're going to come back and, okay, this was just a crazy 5 years in the history of the nation and we're done now, or whatever, and it keeps just getting like more wild and more. I'm like, is this crazy train ever going to stop? And so then I start to ask myself, I'm like, okay, well, God is in all this somehow. Like, God, what are you doing in all this? Like, what is going on? And that was one of the reasons why I decided to take on the issue of the book, to be honest, is because this kept becoming a focal point in discussions. And so I felt just the burden of that, I guess, to some degree.
And so maybe leading up to that moment, can you give a little bit of your story, a little bit of your testimony? So earlier, of course, in your introduction, I talked about photographer for Rolling Stone and Sony, and you've traveled a bit, and maybe talk a little bit about the road that kind of led you up until that moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in a household that was fractured in some ways. In the sense that my mom was really, really, my mom got saved at a Billy Graham conference when she was 30. And my dad was not quite on that page. We've had kind of a total restoration in our family, and my dad's been walking with the Lord for the last 15 years. So that's a truly,
praise God,
like a miracle. But I was not, I didn't, my dad never went to church. There was never like that kind of strong, like, presence leading the family that we should be doing this. And so I just got involved with a lot of really crazy stuff when I was very, very young, and started drinking heavily early, got into basically every drug that wasn't around needles, at a very young age. And I was really good at soccer and I played with the Olympic development team. And so this kind of put me in to a category of just a much older demographic than I should have probably been in. And that older demographic really influenced me at a young age. And then I got kind of radically, there's a whole long story around this that involves new age stuff, spiritualisms like peyote, ayahuasca, kind of all this stuff, very similar to what you were talking about.
We can talk about all that.
Yeah. And so the Lord kind of radically saved me, out of all this. And so, I describe in the, the introduction of the book that my connection to Israel is really accidental. I was not a Zionist when I went to Israel first. And I did not have a strong position on this. I couldn't have told you about, church history and the Jewish people. I had none of this. At this point, I was really just kind of a recent believer, on fire for the Lord, just doing the best that I could to follow where he led me. And that led me to basically a 2 years living in Israel. And so that's really where the story started for me. And that was back in 2007. And so, that's a very, very compressed version of that story, but, it's probably not unfamiliar. It's very similar to what you talked about in your background.
Yeah. I think Israel was literally the last thing that I ever expected to be. Well, there's something poetic about that. Of course, I grew up in a Jewish family, right? And I remember my family being we were religiously Jewish, and I mean that like in a positive sense until I was like 12 years old. I was bar mitzvah when I was 13, but the reason why it was until I was 12 was because that was when my mom's dad, my maternal grandfather, passed away, and he was really the patriarch of the family. But it was with him that we would go to all the high holiday services, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at Symphony Hall, and why we would celebrate Passover in Hebrew. So he really anchored the Jewish traditions of the family, and he died when I was 12, and so those kind of went by the wayside. And so there's something very poetic in many different ways for me, being at this stage of my life now, approaching questions of, what does it mean to be a man of Jewish ethnicity and becoming a Christian, and also the question of Israel. And these questions were not part of my upbringing, but there's a fittingness to them. And I think the same is true for you. Like there's a fittingness to, God leading you on the path that he did, like why we would be talking about this right now. And you can look back, maybe putting the pieces together, looking backwards.
Absolutely. It's definitely providential. And, as you and I were talking about last week, I find it so fascinating because so many Jewish people that I know that are believers now, I was talking to a guy last week who used to party with Jerry Garcia. He was on tour with the Grateful Dead, a guy who's kind of been a spiritual father to me as a Jewish man who's, 70, almost 76, 77 years old now. His whole background was running LSD through Hawaii. He went to Berkeley, he was up at Pratt in Brooklyn. He almost threw himself off the building, on an LSD trip. Just like all stories that we would relate to. And I think that's so fascinating because they've all kind of said the same thing, that the Jewish heart is searching for God. That there's something in the Jewish heart that recognizes that it's been disconnected from the Lord in some ways, and they're all searching after that. And so I don't think I know a single Jewish story that it does not have very much describing like what you described in yours. The details are different, but it's like, they're heavily seeking, they're pushing the boundaries of reality. They are trying to figure out, should they be a yogi? Should they be this? Should they, they're after something, And so I just so agree that it's so beautiful and poetic that the Lord brings us back to Israel in this kind of metaphorical sense,
Mm-hmm. Can we talk for a little bit about our shared background in the New Age? I think people would find that interesting. I know a lot of my listeners come from that world or are certainly interested by it. And, maybe you and I have talked about this offline. I think, well, Lord willing, when a lot of this kind of craziness around the Jews is over, I think we're going to see a resurgence of New Age ideas and sort of neo-paganism that is just right behind it. I can't say that for sure. There was a time when I was more confident in that. I don't know how long it's going to take to exit from this current madness, but I see just the surge, especially with the influencer, biohacker, entrepreneur Brian Johnson. 2 or 3 weeks ago did a mega dose of the most powerful psychedelic on earth, 5-MeO DMT. And so, now that's been all the buzz of one big part of Twitter, just talking about psychedelics, the rapid normalization of it. And maybe actually, now that I think about it, maybe these phenomena are connected. Is that you have, because I know that at the bottom of the New Age world, is where the protocols of the Elders of Zion lives, and that's where I first heard about it. And so maybe this rapid repaganization, all the hell is empty and all the devils are here, targeting the Jews. Maybe there's something to this.
No, that's really interesting. I think that one of the powerful and potent animating forces, at least for me, when I was connected to the New Age spiritualism and the psychedelics, and along with that, I think comes a heavy dose of skepticism about what normies believe and what the institutions are saying, right? And so that naturally lends itself into the conspiratorial perspective, whether we're talking about health, medical stuff, government, all that stuff. And so within all that, I think, I look back at that time and I think about like, man, how I was so deceived, but I was so convinced I was right. And that's a pretty wild feeling to have, of feeling so confident. But I do think that psychedelics and that whole world lends itself to convincing yourself that you're right in this really profound way, because psychedelics are such a profound experience, and within that, you just have this sense of, feeling like you've found the truth in some ways. And that's one of the things that I find is really difficult about this moment that we're in, is how convinced everyone is of their own discovery of truth as they see it,
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think the problem with there are many problems with psychedelics, but one of the problems is that is that it creates this impression and these feelings that, no, what I experienced is so real and you can't convince me otherwise. It's like, yes, okay, you had the sensations and thoughts and feelings that you did. That's real, but you can't verify the truthfulness of them. I went to go talk to Mama Ayahuasca, and she said that, I should become a traveling circus stripper or whatever. Like, okay, fine. And there's a lot of that, but it's like, okay, I will accept that you had the experience, the inner experience of sitting down and talking with a spirit who told you. It's like, can you call them back and just ask some follow-up questions? Is there any way to verify this? And they're like, even if I say, I believe you're telling the truth, can you go and check up on that? Can you contact that spirit again and say, did you really mean that? Or did I mishear you? Like, I was distracted. And it creates this impression like, no, what I've experienced is so real. You're now challenging my truth. And there's no external transcendent standard of truth to measure anything by. And psychedelics is the ultimate manifestation of that.
Yes, it becomes very inward focused. I don't even think intentionally. I don't think these people doing this when I wouldn't, I would say that I would have perceived myself as having a very open heart towards that, like the outward world and my experience and all of these things. But when I reflect back on it, it's exactly like what you're saying. I was so dialed into these experiences that I was having that were so personal and that were so deeply I could kind of share them with other people, like the parts that I could remember. It would never come across as profound as it felt in my psyche and in my emotions when I was having those experiences, But if you think about that, that's totally... It's very, it's a little bit like navel gazing. You're just kind of like looking in a mirror and just like creating this reality around these experiences that you're having. But it is, I often describe it. Have you ever seen the movie Inception?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, you have this kind of whole, the whole philosophy of this movie is essentially like, you go into these dream states because that's where the real world is. It's not, the real world is not what you're experiencing day to day. The real world is when you go into the dream state. And so I used to describe psychedelics as this experience that, like what you think that you're experiencing out here is what you think is real, but it's not. When you go into like the psychedelic world, wherever that is, that's like the dream state. Like that's the real state of like where your heart is and all these other, you could just kind of go off. And so I don't know. I always found that that movie very, as a great analogy for what to me the psychedelic experience really felt like.
It's just pure Gnosticism, right?
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
This reality, this material reality. Here we are on the ground with sights and sounds and smells. That's not actually real. You have to go inside yourself into this other transcendent realm, and that's where real reality is. And in fact, when I was making my way out of the New Age, like into into Christianity, the big popular thing was Australian Aboriginal spirituality. And because the way the New Age works is that it syncretizes, right? So it syncretizes all these different traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and psychedelics and UFOs and all those different, but mashes it all together. But in order to keep the meter running, it always goes and adopts new traditions, right? And so in the 1970s, it was like all about the Native Americans, right? And then it became, in the 80s, it was all about Africa, and then in the 2000s, it was all about Polynesia, and so now it's all about Aboriginal, and their whole thing was about the dream time. The dream time is this altered state where like the dream time is the real reality, and that's their spirituality. And so of course it confirms everyone's pre-existing notions,
right?
But you just get lost in it. You totally get lost in it.
Yeah. I don't know. I just go back to how real it feels when you're in it, and it feels so like, when you compare that to just the normal life of working like a 9 to 5 or whatever it is you're doing in life at that time, it's like, wow, that, it feels so powerful. But to me, that's also the amazing thing about becoming a believer, what that's done to my heart in like a real sense, is that feels so much more solid. Like I think about where I used to be, and I'm, first of all, I'm just like so thankful to the Lord that he rescued me out of my own, insanity. But I just think about how stable and how solid and how like just fundamentally aligned with what is real the gospel is, and how that is such a strong and powerful force in such a stormy world. And so I just, in many ways, like, my wife and I are totally different in this regard. Like she never experienced any of this stuff. And we talk about what the gospel has done for us in very different ways. And so in the light of like my past, I'm so thankful for the gospel, and so is she. It's just a very different. We just come to it in different ways because we have different experiences of how we both got here. And so, I don't know. I sometimes I just cry out to the Lord. I just thank Him for sobriety. I thank Him for just being clear. I love waking up clear in the morning. I had so many years where it wasn't that way, and I just think about it now. Like I'm so thankful for it.
That was I can relate absolutely to that. It's not so long ago that I was discovering the doctrine of sola scriptura, and one of the things that was so reassuring about that, it's like, look, if you have questions, there's one place you can go to. That's not a whole bunch of different people and teachers and books and all this different stuff, that may say contradictory things that kind of overlap or any of that. You don't have to master thousands of years worth of stuff. You can just go to one book and you can read it. And then, once I was beginning to understand that, up here, you can't, maybe you can't really see it, but there's this blue book like up on my shelf right here. That's the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Nice.
And the reason why I have that there is because when I was introduced to that in summer of 2023 by Pastor David Reese, it was like coming home, but like lying on. This was the visceral feeling of it, lying on cool, hard stone. Right. Like, but not in this uncomfortable way, but in a way that I could finally rest. Yeah. Like, oh, someone has systematized all of the stuff so that I can understand it. And it was like, finally I could put my weight on something. Finally I could rest on something. And it was so powerful after so many years in the New Age, which is like swimming. It's like you're just struggling to find any kind of firm ground, and it isn't there. And you can put your feet down on scripture and rest there. Right.
Right. Totally. The openness of the New Age movement, which is kind of the inherent, one of the real distinct aspects of it. Right. Because you can't judge anything. Like you can't say that this is good or this is bad. It's like, it's very, and because of that, I think, I've even just the women that I connected with in that time, they were all so like, that was so animating to them as this kind of free-spirited, non-judgmentalism, but none of them were ever balanced or in a place that I would describe as like fundamentally sound. Like they were never on solid ground. And it's not just a female thing. I mean, it was like all of us were that way. But it is so reassuring to come back to a gospel and to like the Word of God in a way that you have something to stand on. Like, and I think it's hard to appreciate that unless you really know what it's like to be blown around by something that is not stable in that way.
That is a great way of putting it. Yeah, like and I've encountered this. Maybe you have as well. It's like I come into the church from the world having been blown around, for the longest time, like a tumbleweed or like a wind just being, and of course I think I'm like, oh no, I'm totally in control. I know exactly what I'm doing. I have no idea what I'm doing. Right. And then I come in and it's like I'm holding, in healthy ways so tightly to these teachings, these doctrines, like this is the gospel. You guys have this, right? And of course to come into the church and find people who take that for granted. Yeah. And it's like, what do you do? And who want to get blown around, like, no, you don't really don't.
No, totally.
And what an interesting kind of divide that's kind of been. And I understand it, right?
Sure.
Maybe you've encountered the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I heard one of my favorite things on this is I forget who said this, but someone said that your perspective on the bigness of the cross is directly connected to like the sin that you've seen in your own life, and so it's kind of like if you have a small perspective on your own sin, on your own failures, on your own like I am not deceived by how bad I can make my life. I'm actually incredibly good at making my life horrible. Like I'm the CEO of Goldman Sachs of making my life as bad as it can be. And so, it's like when I look at it that way and I think about what the Lord has ransomed and taken me from, I don't know, I can see the gospel in that light in a way that I think some people, and this is really what Paul says, where sin abounds, grace abounds. And so, which is not, I'm not saying that people should go sin to figure out like God's grace, but I think that it is connected to our stories, and God brings us all on different journeys, and we all arrive in this place for different reasons. But I think that it's just, I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to talk about some of my experiences, and to communicate them in a way that demonstrates, I don't know, the emotional reality they have to me without sensationalizing the things that I've been through. It's difficult to talk about. Like, yes, obviously it was grievous sin. It was idolatry. It was all of these terrible, terrible things. And like I'm communicating this in a way so that you understand the impact on me at the time. Not that I'm telling you to go do that. And I think that's a reality. And maybe it's one that a lot of people are going to be dealing with, because one of the things that I've seen lately is there's a real New Age to Christ movement. It's primarily women at this point, and not a lot of men I've seen have been coming up, but perhaps that will change. Where it's like, no, we need to be prepared to talk about this movement that has gripped the American religious landscape for, I mean, not just 80 years going back to the 60s. Let's be real. Like the Transcendentalists in the 1800s were a huge part of it, and the Theosophical Society and the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. Like, it didn't just explode out with the Beatles in 1967 or whatever, right? There was more to it than that. Not that the Beatles didn't play a signal role, which they absolutely did. They were the tip of the spear in many ways, but there was a long spear behind it. But like, there's going to be a lot of people coming out that are going to be talking about this stuff. Yeah. It's like, how, like to be able to facilitate or be able to help people understand that conversation when people have had these experiences that are part of who they are, but that doesn't mean they're celebrating them. I certainly don't. I think they can be teaching tools.
Absolutely. And I think that, I'm from Colorado originally, where they've decriminalized, mushrooms, at least at this point. And, I remember when they did this with weed, it radically shifted, the whole city, which I was kind of naive enough at that time to think it probably wasn't going to be like a huge deal, and I think it was, which, I was definitely more libertarian leaning at that point. And, it's completely ravaged Colorado. And I think that the psychedelics is going to make it just much worse. And, I imagine that is going to be a trend that we see. And so I think that these topics are going to become more, they're going to be another thing that people are going to have to deal with in a real way.
Absolutely.
As this becomes more acceptable,
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to deal with the social ramifications, the social and cultural ramifications of, people who are on all kinds of, in all kinds of altered states due to drugs, or have all kinds of strange beliefs about reality, and that can't be reconciled. And, I think a lot of people, I think that why people get offended with the gospel is to say, like, no, there is one truth. Everything else is false. You are accountable to it before God, no matter whether or not you like it. And for people that live in a my truth, your truth kind of world, that's deeply offensive and always has been. But now you take powerful mind-altering chemicals that have been legalized and sanctioned for psychological use, meaning like you're going to treat your trauma with this drug, and suddenly you pour jet fuel on a brush fire. And that's what I see coming. I pray God spares us from that. I don't see a lot of ways to avoid that.
I totally agree with you, and I think it's very hard too. I think the church is also going to have a hard time. It's hard to compete in a culture that's so much of the currency is experience, right? Like people are chasing, they want that experience, they want that. And maybe it's becoming less this way in Gen Z, but I know that for millennials, one of the big things was all about like the experience. Like we want to just go experience like the real, whatever that is. And so it's very difficult as a church to compete with how profound and how intense a psychedelic experience feels. And it also can, depending on your mindset, it can feel very spiritual. It can feel very like you are really getting out there and experiencing something true, real, good, beautiful, meaningful, all these things, and so I think it's hard to compare. It's hard to contrast, the Western church and that experience, and not feel like the church is in some ways wanting towards the spiritual, mystical aspects of reality. And I think a lot of people are going to try to fuse those in a way that it is not going to work, but I think that they're going to try.
That's a really good point. I had someone in the evangelical world say, he doesn't think, because a lot of the big mega churches, the laser light show kind of ones, like they're always just a few years behind the culture. And he felt confident that, it's not long before they start trying to figure out ways to bring psychedelics or something like that into the services as a way of reaching the people or whatever. And I think that would be a bridge quite far, but I also don't think it's impossible. But to me, the big threat is, people who have developed a religious level belief in the idea of childhood trauma. That is one of the signature religious beliefs of the West today. And how do you treat childhood trauma? You treat it with psychotherapy, and for a lot of people, it ends up in depression and anxiety. And then you treat it with antidepressants. Yeah. And like RFK Jr.'s whole thing about it is like, why would you take a year's worth of Prozac or antidepressants to treat your depression and anxiety when you can just take mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca once, and here are all the studies that show that it goes away. And so if people have this religious belief in childhood trauma, it's like, well, you can take, years worth of drugs and years worth of therapy, or, one night with this psychedelic drug and it all goes away. Yeah. I think that's going to be just an insanely powerful thing that slips in through the back door that the church has left completely open, just not wanting to discuss, let's take a biblical perspective on suffering. If we just abandon that, just throw it out and let the pagans have it, let the psychologists have it. And so now you're going to get, seven devils coming in.
Mm-hmm. I can testify. 5 years ago in 2020, I had a major pastor of a mega church in Colorado reach out to me and ask me if I would recommend that he did psychedelics because of sexual abuse he experienced when he was younger. Yikes. And he wanted to do it through, I think it was Johns Hopkins. They were going to do like, they had one of the official studies. It was kind of the whole thing. And so this was 5 years ago, before any of this stuff. I mean, and as soon as stuff gets decriminalized and legal, that takes the kind of the cultural barrier off of it. And, you're just right there at the kind of the door of this. And I think what's really hard is once you start engaging in this, one of the fascinating things to me about like marijuana, for instance, weed, what it does to your frontal cortex, or the frontal part of your brain that makes decisions on whether smoking weed is good for you or not, it totally fogs that part of like your brain. And so basically what that means is that people that are actively engaged with it can't even process whether it's good for them to be doing it or not, because they've fogged that part of the brain that would evaluate whether that decision was good for them or not. And I think that with psychedelics and all this other stuff, because of how strong the experience is, it's going to create the kind of the same scenario. And it's really hard. I mean, if you want to fast for 10, 14 days, like I've done this, and I feel like, you can really get to a place in your spirit that is actually, to me, very reminiscent of psychedelics. Maybe not in kind of the visual sense that psychedelics would bring, but certainly like in my spirit. But who wants to pay the cost of the spiritual, of fundamentally being spiritually disciplined in a way that you can go after that, right? When you can just eat a quart of mushrooms and it's like, you're right there in an hour. So it's like, I think that shortcut will always be more desirable for the majority of people, unfortunately.
That's a great observation. I've fasted for 10 days while I was traveling at a retreat center in Thailand, just a 10-day cleanse and fast. But I fasted, I think the longest I've fasted here in the States has been 5 days. And one of the reasons I love doing it is, one, obviously you get a whole bunch of time back. It's like, I don't have to eat or do dishes or anything like that, or cook, right? It's like I get 3 hours back a day. Amazing. But another reason is I just love the clarity. I love the mental clarity, the spiritual clarity, right? And you're absolutely correct that you can accomplish something that's much healthier, through real discipline and resistance to the world. But you can have a pseudo version of that, a false version of that, through taking these substances. You can have a false version of a feeling of transcendence through taking these substances. Of course, you can also have that through prayer. You can have that through Bible study, right? By the daily spiritual disciplines to engage with God and His Word, you can have these experiences in a way where there's no grief or hangover added onto in them. There's no deception that comes in with it. Like, oh no, I saw this thing and that must be true because I saw it. It's like, that's not accurate.
Right.
I saw Jesus. Oh my goodness. Someone sent me a reel on Instagram. Here's Judd Apatow, the famous, I think he's like a Hollywood producer or something like that. I took ayahuasca and I saw Jesus on the cross. Good. I'm with you so far. Okay. But I learned that we're just all supposed to be there for each other. Like, I don't know. That's what that means.
That went, right. So,
exactly. So
there we go.
Yeah. It's like, but he seemed so convinced of it. And the interviewer was like, what did you, and it's like, no, that's not what you're supposed to get from that at all. And I hear that people have experiences with Jesus on this. It's like, look, you don't need to take drugs for that. And you don't actually know that is what you think it is. But I know where you can find Jesus every single day if you want, in his word. And it's this substitute. It's this counterfeit that's so seductive of being just almost there, but it's that last little bit that makes all the difference.
I remember one time this was a period of life when I was living in Denver, and we would go down to Taos in Santa Fe frequently because, we would rent these earth ships and these kind of like, desert communities and do all this stuff. And, I remember fasting for 3 days before one of them. And then I ate just a huge amount of mushrooms. And, I was kind of just around this fire in the desert of Mexico and thinking that I was like pursuing the Lord. I mean, I was really convinced of this. I was reading the Bible and I was kind of, doing this whole thing. And the conviction of the Lord hit me in the morning so difficult, like so strong. It was so just like clear in my spirit. Like, you cannot seek me in this method. Like I will not be found when you try to come through like this door. And, it took me probably another year before that message really before I was able to do something with that message. But I just remember how strong like the Spirit convicted me when I tried to mix those two worlds. And it was really, I don't think that's the way forward. I cannot see how that's going to end well.
No, it's not, because you're going to run into questions of authority. Like if your subjective authority on this psychedelic tells you one thing, but Scripture tells you something else, you got to choose. You got to choose between those two. And I think I think the vast majority of people would say, I'm going to trust my experience over what Scripture says, and that's a mistake. Yeah. Totally. That is a deadly error, and that I think is one of the true dangers of is to say, no, my subjective experience in this altered, intoxicated state, if it stands in contradiction to Scripture, I'm going to go with that over what God says. Yeah, I that's going to lead so many astray.
One of the one of the fascinating things about this conversation, if we to turn it back to Israel kind of slightly,
please.
So many of my Jewish friends who are now walking with Jesus, who live in Israel, have all been radically saved through New Age festivals in Israel. So, October 7th was one of these New Age festivals. I mean, people just hammered Israel because it is exactly like what they say. I mean, they're like these mini Burning Man experiences, where, and I think that one of the things that people don't recognize within many of the young people in Israel, and they don't recognize this because they view Jews as kind of this monolithic, like, octopus with tentacles and just destroying everything. But the reality for most Jews, especially under the age of 40, is that they are deeply, deeply struggling right now. Like, they're massively depressed. They're anxious. They are going through, I mean, they've been raised in conflict in a way that we do not understand. They're all conscripted in the IDF. They generally, many of them, like, really struggle with like their entire life in Israel. And one of the things that they love to do after their IDF service is they normally take that year and a half off and they travel. A lot of times that's to India or to these places that have these kind of new agey places, and they get kind of captivated by this thing. And the way that they experience that in Israel is going to these festivals. But I've seen, there's believers in Israel that go to these things specifically to try to talk to people that are, in this moment, exactly basically kind of how you were, radically shifted when you were a Burning Man. It's exactly like that. And it's amazing what God can do with even just hearts that are seeking, like it is amazing. Like, I would rather interact with a new ager who is kind of on this journey of trying to find this out than like a militant atheist, for instance. Like it just like there's an openness in the heart of someone who's actually seeking the Lord. And it's one of the places that I've seen Jesus work like the most profoundly are in the New Age festivals in Israel.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a difference between the apostles of false religion and the refugees from it. And that was the thing for me, is I was genuinely seeking. I genuinely wanted to know, which is why my experience with Camp Spirit Dream at Burning Man in 2015 was so powerful. I didn't become a Christian immediately after that. It actually took about 5 years. But like the reason why I connected with them, the reason why I continued pursuing relationship with them, driving to Carson City, Nevada to meet them for a seminar they were giving in October, a couple months later, and then flying up for Christmas. And the reason why I kept in touch with them while I was traveling is they had something real. Yeah. They were sincere. They were joyful. They were loving. They were welcoming, right? And so that registered with me because I wasn't like they were Christians, but I wasn't going to throw them out because of that. I didn't have some I have all the answers. It was just like, okay, I don't really know what to do with that, but I'm not going to reject it and say like, no, I know that's false. Right. But like, and there are people who are like that. I've gotten in fights with, people that I was formerly close with in the New Age who, they won't talk to me anymore since I've become a Christian. And they get quite angry at the notion of Christianity. And yet there are so many people who are genuinely looking and have never had a real exposure. Maybe they had parents who were hypocritical about the whole thing in various ways. But most, like me, I'd never really had a genuine experience of Christianity. And I think people who are seeking in the New Age are very open to that. And I think more missionary activity needs to be directed in that mission field.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you're right. There's kind of, you'll basically discover one of two people. You'll discover like actual, true, authentic seekers, or you'll discover people who the idea of committing to one thing feels so dogmatic and so in violation to the whole reason why we're doing the New Age thing that they just cannot stand it. And they don't understand in that moment that's like its own box. That's like, that is a fundamental belief that they have, is that you cannot have any fundamental belief. And so, it is interesting, but I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting touch point when talking about the New Age is how many Jewish people I've seen come to Jesus through the New Age stuff in Israel.
Yeah. And I would imagine for them, their experience would be similar to me, where it's like, so they are Jewish in some cultural sense. Then they enter the New Age, then they find Christ, who then leads them back to the Old Testament and to being Jewish again. Yeah. And I was talking to Brian Crawford about this, who was he was a guest on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, "Yeah, that's a very common experience." I'm like, it was so reassuring, because I've had to reevaluate, what does it mean to be Jewish now that I'm encountering Jesus and here's the Old Testament, and it's like, oh wait, so this is what it actually meant, and I had to go this big long route.
It's like you took the circle like the opposite direction.
Absolutely. Everything Chris and I have said in this conversation, the clarity about deception, the confidence in Scripture, the ability to look at the New Age and see exactly what it is and what it isn't, we didn't used to have any of that. We were in it, all the way in. Burning Man, Ayahuasca, energy work, the whole seeking path. We thought we were finding God. We were walking away from Him. What you've been listening to for the last hour is what it sounds like on the other side. That's not us. That's the grace of God. And here's what I know from my own exit. The hardest part isn't leaving. The hardest part is the morning after, when you're out but you can't explain why, when you know something was wrong but you don't have the words, when someone you love is still in it and every conversation pushes them further away because you sound like you just traded one religion for another. That's the gap I built exiting the New Age to close. Not so you can win an argument, so you can see clearly. And so the people you love have a chance to see clearly too. If this conversation stirred something in you, if you heard your own story and ours, this is your next step. And if you have someone in your life who talks the way Chris and I used to, this might be the most important thing you ever hand them. willspencer.co/exit. Link in the show notes. Yeah. I think the thing about the New Age, just to bring it back to Israel again for a second, is also that I've seen the New Age world try to successfully, well, more or less, syncretize every different faith tradition around the world. They even have something called the cosmic Christ or the Christ consciousness.
Yeah.
You know what they can't syncretize? They can't syncretize the Old Testament. They can't do it with the 10 Commandments, right? They try and the gematria, they try and do all that, but they just, that's the one thing that the New Age can't swallow.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, obviously, and Christ as sola scriptura Christianity obviously is a huge part of that, but they don't even try with the Jews, maybe sometimes a little bit with Solomon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting. And that's, I found out there's actually a lot of hatred for the Jews in the New Age world.
Yeah. I mean, you push on anything hard enough and there's hatred of the Jews behind it. It doesn't matter where you go. It's everywhere. Thanks. Yeah. There's
oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to think, maybe you can help me remember, what is that? There's actually like a name for that tradition that tries to incorporate all religions into its belief system.
Perennialism, the perennial tradition?
Yeah, there's something that they actually have like temples though. Like there's a temple in Haifa that is one of these. Haifa is in northern Israel. And I'm trying to remember like what it is. One of my friends from the New Age movement got married in a ceremony that incorporated Islam and Judaism and Christianity, and it's not universalism. It is in a sense, but there's actually like a name that's escaping me, but it doesn't matter. There's going to be someone who's listening to it who's like, it's this, and I'm not remembering it.
Yes, please send it in via my website if you're listening. So just to pick up another thread from your bio, how does photography fit into all this? Because photography used to be a passion of mine as well, I know that you've done a lot of that. It sounds like you've done quite a great many number of things.
Yeah, I think so. I got into my accounting and finance degree, and I think it was my first internship in DC where I was like, oh my gosh, if I do this for the rest of my life, like I'm going to like have a mental breakdown. I hate this, but I was like watching all my friends get these degrees that I was like, dude, you're not going to be able to do anything with that. Like at least I have this, like if everything goes totally sideways. And so I really just picked it up as a hobby. This is before iPhones, photography had not been commoditized the way it is now. I mean, now it's like, I think it'd be pretty hard to make it as a photographer right now. I mean, there's always going to be the Anna Leibowitzes and these destination wedding photographers who charge 20 grand or whatever. But generally speaking, iPhones have made photography so accessible that there's really not the market for it that there was. And so I was just kind of getting into it because I enjoyed it and was looking for another way to maybe branch my brain out in certain directions. And just kind of one thing led to another, and I knew some people that were pretty big in the music industry and got to, jump on tour with U2 for a little bit and some other bands that were, really pretty influential, and kind of one thing led to another. And I just was able to take those experiences and turn them into something.
So for those who might have missed it, you got to go on tour with U2 for a while. So, say more about that. What era was that? Was it the Zoo TV era?
No, the Elevation tour. So
Elevation, okay.
Whether that was 2003, maybe 2004, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
What was that like?
That was at the time the largest stadium tour in the world. 82 semis, I think, is what it took to put that stage. 82 semis.
82, meaning like there 82 semis would drive from city to
city with their stage stuff, and it would only fit in massive amphitheaters that these big Coliseum like places, and it was maybe a 30 city tour, something like that. So
in the United States.
In the United States, yeah. So they traveled with a band called The Fray here, and then I think that it might have actually, no, it was not. It couldn't have been Radiohead. I forget who the Europe counterpart was, but
Sigur Rós.
I did travel with Sigur Rós as well, but that was for a different thing. That was not the U2 tour.
Wow.
Yeah.
82 how long would it take them to set this up?
It was like 2 days. I mean, and they had a massive crew. Yeah, I know. Well, but I mean, they had something like 100 guys doing it, you know?
Wow. That's
Yeah.
incredible. And so you're there to document the shows or the entire process, or
yeah, behind the scenes, the shows, the loadout, all that kind of stuff. And so it's so funny. One of the reasons, now that I think about this, that I really got into it, there was a photographer who I was obsessed with his black and white images that he was taking of Burning Man. And so this was really like the young internet age, and I was using that internet browser called StumbleUpon. I don't know. Do you remember that? I think we talked about this, but I had stumbled upon this photographer who did these insane images, black and white, grainy film images of Burning Man. And they were just like so apocalyptic and beautiful, and kind of just like it just felt like a different world. And I remember how much that photographer influenced me into wanting to be a photographer. And I can't even remember his name now, but all part of the journey, you know?
Mm-hmm. So as you're on tour through 30 cities in the United States, watching this 82 semi, epic, probably the largest, certainly the largest music production of its time, ever. Well, and you would have been in your early 20s, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness! What sort of things did you see on the inside of the music industry? Because I've worked in the music industry as well. That's another overlap that we have. I was in the audio engineering field from 2007 until 2010, 2011, something like that. So I've seen behind the scenes of a certain part of the music world as well. And like the thing about the music world is it doesn't look the same way behind the scenes as it does in front of the stage. Not at all.
Yeah. I don't think that people who live like lives at that level, talking about like Bono, The Edge, these guys, I don't think that they probably feel the sense that they could be real with anyone that they didn't grow up with and that didn't, have been a part. There's always kind of this exterior wall, and I think you can kind of treat that one of two ways. I think it always exists. You can either kind of take the the Madonna route, and you want red Skittles, and you want, all this kind of, you're just like, you take it, you start to really buy into your own myth. And actually the U2 guys were not that way. They were, I found them actually very humble and very quiet, reserved. Like you weren't getting I don't feel like it's not like I got like intimate details, but I definitely feel like they were very closed off. And I think that's just kind of the nature of that. But I don't know. I think I was probably starry-eyed, but I was really fascinated by it. I didn't, and I wasn't in like deep into the inner workings of things,
of
but,
course.
I do think that a lot of that world moves through transactional relationships, being either money or, unfortunately the sexual side of things, which that was actually very surprising to me, was to see that dimension of, It very much feels to me like the Harvey Weinstein thing, where deals are made because of what you're willing to compromise on, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. I worked for a small engineering studio in San Francisco, in 2009, 2010, something like that. And, it was a satellite, it wasn't a huge, studio by any means, but I could definitely understand that, there were layers to the game, that there were, I worked with a bunch of guys that just wanted to make a living in the music industry, and they were happy to have middle-class lifestyles, making music, making music their lives, not that they ever had big expectations of stardom. Maybe at one point, many of them had, and those hadn't worked out. And so they had managed to hew out a career in music. But I definitely got the sense from being in that world that there were guys that, had achieved stardom, and there was something about them, so they would come through the studio. There was something about them. It's like, there's something missing here, and I can't quite, but we are not the same. They're obviously humble and stuff like that, but it's like, you get the sense that there's definitely layers to it. Maybe the guys who are setting up the thing and driving the semi and, doing all the backstage stuff, they're just making a living in the music industry.
Right. Yeah.
But the people at the highest level, they've got other stuff going on.
There's the deal maker level. And, I was fascinated to read, I think it was an expose that came out recently on Silicon Valley, which we have both been connected with to some degree. And it was talking about, how much of the funding is basically deals made by Peter Thiel and that group that are all kind of based on it's basically Harvey Weinstein. Like it's all kind of homosexual stuff that is like you can have money if you do these things, if you come to Peter Thiel's party, and that requires this. It was like an open expose on this stuff, and none of that surprises me. I think that there's a layer of this life that people talk about Epstein like it's this shocking thing. Like I think this is probably it is shocking, obviously, for all the reasons that it should be shocking. But I think it's far more, it's happening in way more things than people understand. And I think that people underestimate what happens when you get so much money, that what you start to explore, like the level of deviancy that you can go into when you kind of have all of your other needs met financially in ways that the normal person can't even comprehend, what you start to develop an appetite for in all these different things. I just think that the world functions at this level in a way that is so far outside of even just, state stuff, geopolitical stuff, governmental stuff. I mean, it's all there too, but it's just another currency. It's another currency that exists that, it's not power, it's not money, it's something totally different, and when you have these other things met, that's just the natural thing. Unless you have something tethering you, like a belief in something real, that's inherently, I think, where the human heart goes.
Yeah. And just to bring it back to religion, it makes sense why people would reject the notion of Judeo-Christianity. And I use that word specifically, like you can reject Christ because he applies. You reject Judaism because the Jews were the recipients of the moral law, the oracles of God, right? Yeah. And so this is now written, it's now documented, it's now known. And then you can reject Christ because he now applies the moral law to you. And you can understand why in this world of sexual and moral compromise and, literally selling souls, like I've definitely, come to get the sense that souls, there's a big market for souls out there, and they're worth a lot of money. That people who are in that world and have made those deals, big and small, that's the sort of thing that would like stick in their throat a little bit to know that, like, you've bowed to the God of this world, but the God of the Bible sees that and he calls you to repentance, but what's at great cost, right? Camels and eyes of needles.
It becomes, and I think that we underestimate what happens when the Lord gives us over to ourselves.
Oh, sure.
When he allows you to have the thing that you think you want, and you choose to make that thing other than him, it's very hard to come back from that place.
It's possible, but it might cost you your life, and that's kind of the place that I've gotten to is, I think a lot of people who have become very famous, certainly can't say all, but many have done these deals, and there is, footage of them doing awful things, and that's the incentive not to repent. That doesn't mean you can't repent. You might lose everything, but is your faith that great? And I think, I don't think that's impossible. I just think it's quite scary for people to consider the possibility, and for understandable reasons. Yeah. But perhaps someone needs to.
Yeah. And I think that, we underestimate what compromise does. It's like when you stand up to compromise, you're strengthening that muscle, right? But when you allow yourself to compromise over and over and over, it becomes very hard to, like, once you're really pinned down by whatever you've been compromised by, to then stand up against that, because you've just been letting that compromise wear down that muscle that you would usually use to fight against that over and over and over. And so it takes something jarring, usually, some just mercy of God that shakes you out of that, and that gives you this moment of strength that you can hopefully pop up from that.
Hallelujah for that. So it kind of makes sense now, just to kind of bring it all the way back around. I can understand why there's a rising enthusiasm for Christianity in this sort of like trendy sense. I think there was an article in, was it New York Times or something, or the Atlantic or something like that? It was last week, saying, Christianity is the new hot thing among New York City's elite, and we can all be seen at such and such mass at such and such a church. I'm like, that ain't it, right? But I can understand, right? I can understand why it's trendy until you get to the point where like, oh yeah, there's this question of the Jews. There's this question of the Old Testament. There's this question of this aspect of God. Can you love that aspect of God, or are you only going to like the red letters in the New Testament?
Yeah. I think that a really great indicator of something that's worth examining deeper is when the entire world is angry about one thing or focused on one thing or frustrated by one thing, it's maybe worth looking at that one thing and seeing if you can see why. And generally I've found that when everyone is moving one direction, it's good to move the other as a general rule.
So maybe as we just bring this to a close, can you talk about, and just to bring it back to the book, can you talk about what it was like for you? Again, we've just, gone the high level overview, maybe even a mid-level overview of so many different aspects of your story, and mine too, which we share. What it was like turning your attention after these years to the one thing that everyone is kind of angry about. What has this process been like for you?
Yeah. Well, something that you probably won't pick up in the book that was very challenging for me is this was a really actually emotionally difficult project for me to take on. I'll tell this very crazy experience that I had that I don't think I've shared anywhere at this point. I was getting ready to write this book. So this is probably about a year ago. And, I'm wrestling with all sorts of levels of self-doubt. And, first of all, like, can I write a book at all? The very practical side of this, but then also just the heaviness of the issue. Like, I felt the weight of it. And so I was sitting in this parking lot one afternoon, and I'm on the phone on my Bluetooth, and I've got my windows up, and there's a guy like who's like walking around the parking lot, and it's kind of weird. Like he's not like at my car yet, but I see him kind of going up and down the lanes, and I'm registering it as odd. And African-American guy, he gets to my window and he's just like looking at me outside the window, and I'm like, man, this is like super odd. And I kind of like point to my ears. And he kind of is trying to, he's talking to me. Like he just will not refuse. Like I'm trying to push him away, like kind of gently, but he will not refuse this. And so I get off the call, I roll the window down. I'm somewhat irritated, and he wants to show me about this like mission trip that he's on in Africa, and he's like trying to raise money for this thing that he's supposedly doing. And I'm just like thinking, this is totally like, dude, go away. Like, I don't want any of this. This is crazy. I'm annoyed, all the things that I am in my kind of fleshly being. And finally he just says like, hey, can I pray for you? And I'm like, okay, I'll let you pray for me. And he starts praying, and I really just like feel the Holy Spirit in his prayer start to like enter into this experience. And he starts praying about this book that I'm supposed to write. And immediately he goes into this, he starts talking about the prophets. And he says, when God would come to the prophets, he would tell them, do not stare at the eyes of the people that you're prophesying to. Like, you need to keep your eyes on the Lord. Like your job is not to judge the faces of the people that you're prophesying to, but like, you need to keep your eyes on the Lord. And this like shook me, dude, in like a major way. Like, I don't have a lot. I still, as soon as he started saying this, I grabbed my phone and I started recording it, because I was like, this is crazy, like what you're saying, And I really felt that way when I was writing this book. Like if I would spend too much time online or just get too caught up into the swirl that was happening, I would feel like the heaviness of it in my spirit. And so I had to really kind of step away from all of that when I was writing this book. And so that's something that I haven't really shared a lot, but it was a very real part of this. It was just the difficulty of writing a book like this in the climate that we're in right now, for I think obvious reasons,
What an incredible story.
Yeah.
And please go ahead.
And that's a verse from Jeremiah, actually. So I don't even think he knew this. Like he just kind of started like saying this whole thing. And it was so just clear that the Lord had put him in this moment, and was just kind of speaking through this like really humble prayer that he was saying. And so it was really a pretty incredible experience, actually.
Well, that certainly has resonance for me. And I think it speaks also to the feeling that I got from reading the book, that you took bold, clear stances, and it was clear that you, as yourself, you were writing. Like, I'm not reading like something academic. I'm reading a man, telling the things that he knows. You're writing to me, and it's very personal. It's very personable, and there are bits where your personality really shines through, and it comes across as like this is a man. This is Christopher taking a bold stance for this very heated, controversial, difficult issue. And I would say, at least from one reader's perspective, that man's prayers for you were answered.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate that. I've been kind of blown away what the Lord has done with the book and just how it's been received. And I'm kind of daily getting texts from big churches that are going through it, and it's just radically helping them navigate this moment in a new way. And so I think, this stand, I know that you know this very well, that it's not an easy stand to take right now. And it's costing us both something. But that's okay. Like I would rather stand alone on something, and I'm not standing alone, and I'm not trying to become a martyr in my own mind.
Of course.
But that's at some point when you take on something like this, you just have to be willing to okay, this come hell or high water, this is what I feel like I have to do right now in this moment, and just hold on and let the Lord do what he's going to do. But I know for me, I just have to stand firm,
Can you talk just briefly about, when the book came out, the reception? You've hinted at some of it, like how that's been since the book launched?
I think it's only been out for 2 weeks, and we've hit multiple bestseller lists on Amazon.
Wow.
We had to keep pushing the book back because it kept being pre-sold out. I'm almost out of books from the first print run that we've done. And so, it's really kind of just going beyond all my wildest expectations. But I think that more than anything, that's just the moment that we're in. I think that, how this works. It's like, there's lots of great ideas out there. There's lots of things that I think for something to be very successful, it needs a combination of the right timing, the right moment, God breathing on it in certain ways that are beyond what you're even capable, of doing in your own strength. And so that for me is how I see this. It's not, I have no idea if I'll ever write another book in my life. It's not about me trying to be a great author or anything like that. I think it's more about the stand that the book takes than anything that I did,
Yeah, absolutely. It's clear that the stand is what matters. The Lord is what matters. His truth and his word is what matters, and the ability to communicate it clearly and to commit to it fully, and to give yourself to that, which I feel you've done.
Yeah. One of my favorite things that I heard at some point in my life, it just kind of stuck with me, but it said, if you don't require their rewards, you don't have to live by their rules. And, I think about that a lot, and I look at how much compromise there is in the world. And I know that compromise is coming from people that just, they want the next level of whatever it is. And they want, and to some degree, I understand that. I'm a father, I'm a husband. I get the drive that comes with that. But I think the question I'm always asking myself is, whose reward am I really after here? That's what I ultimately care about. Whose reward? And, I think that at this point, I have what I want to hear is, well done, my good and faithful servant, one day. That's the reward that I ultimately am seeking after. And so I think that's that was kind of my heart in all this, is God, I don't want to be another confusing voice in this confusion. I just want, I want to transmit what I believe that you're doing in this moment right now,
Amen. I think there's no better testimony, perhaps pun intended, to the book than that. So where would you like to send people to find out more about this book and about
Well, so it's on Amazon. So it's the ebook, and the physical book is out right now. We are at the very tail end of the audiobook recording. It's actually been done, but they're finishing the production. So I'm hoping by the end of next week, it'll be out in audiobook as format. It'll be out in the audiobook format as well, but definitely within 3 weeks, that'll be out as well. And that's all on Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for your generosity of time and spirit and telling your story, and for your friendship and fellowship as well. I've really enjoyed getting to know you during our conversations. This is no exception. And again, congratulations on playing your part in writing this book and sharing the truths that I think the world needs to hear around an incredibly controversial and charged topic that more people need wisdom and healing spoken into.
Well, I appreciate it. And I thank you so much for going through it and being an early first contact and taking a risk on the book. I really appreciate it. And I so appreciate the stand that you're taking right now as well. I don't even have to ask you. I know it's not easy. And so I just appreciate you, bro.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate you as well. And I think you know the feeling. Keep your eyes fixed on God and what's true, and don't want the world's rewards, want his.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much again.
Yep. See ya.